let's talk a little bit about infrastructure, right? Because one of the things in the space, and I think you alluded to it up top, and we look at it a lot, is there's a few platforms right now. There's a few peer-to-peer protocols. There's obviously a lot of missing plumbing, to kind of scale this globally. What are some of the things that you think would be really important in the next 3-6 months to be kind of built to help facilitate scaling NFT-DeFi?
Yeah, and I mean, it's been talked about a lot here today, and Rob and I talked about that on stage earlier. If we're building infrastructure, education is really important in this space, and it's not just education, which is awareness, it's also data. So what we have is we've got specific platforms and protocols at the moment, and they're all disjointed. It's very hard for those new users to come on board that aren't familiar with Dune or some other data gathering source. It's very hard for them to compile and understand, if they're a borrower, for example, what the market should look like. So they're landing on platforms, and their first experiences, they're putting up their NFT, and it could be a blue chip, it could be something that is basically their only it's a significant part of their value or their personal wealth, and they're putting it out on a platform, and it is a little bit hit and miss as to where they may land. So that experience, everybody accepts, needs to be better, right? If you look at some of the traditional metaverse environments, if you look at like World of Warcraft, just going off at a tangent, right? The first thing you do when you land in World of Warcraft is you land in this field, and you very slowly start to interact with this wolf that you've got to have a fight with. But it's very easy, very bite-sized stuff, right? And you don't have that stepping stone here. If you have one particular asset and you're a borrower or a potential borrower, it is very binary, that interaction. So there needs to be a bit of a lead-in experience there. So that needs to be improved. And then other than education, we think that needs to be, it's a part of our concept, is we have a P2P model, but we're providing liquidity through pools. And what we think that does, which we've seen from our traditional lending business, is it drives down pricing, because you have price competition coming into those pools. So there's a particular product or offering or asset that people want to lend to, and they're competing against each other. And what it does is it delivers better experiences for borrower, that price and that competition for liquidity. And then I think, bigger picture, the reason that we've got involved in this space, and I, my PFP is a mutant, and most of our loans have been within the Yuga Labs ecosystem, right? But our bigger vision for getting involved in the space isn't so that we can be lending against JPEGs or monkeys. We see a future where more assets are tokenized, and we're able to provide the financing and plumbing for that. And so what that means, or our view of what that means in the future, is that there has to be a better experience for everybody. Because if you're talking about real estate or luxury items, real tangible assets that people are emotionally attached to, you can't have the experience being exactly like it is at the moment. So those are big areas that need to improve. But we're all working on that, and we're all working on that in the right spirit as well.
No, I think that's extremely valid points, right? So from a perspective of Maker itself, what are things that you are looking at as, hey, if we can do these things in the next, and I know this space moves really fast, so 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, how are you measuring, whether Maker is growing the right way?
Yeah, so the conundrum that we've got is because we're not process or data driven, we're human capital driven, and that borrower relationship. So that's incredibly intensive and inefficient if we're lending for 30 days. Okay, so there's a few things that we need to change. We need to turn those shorter term loans, where we're having to deploy a lot of my time and some of the team's time interacting with borrower, getting to know them. We need to turn those 30-day loans into longer loans, okay? And that's really problematic at the moment, because we don't want to, for all the risk reward stuff, we don't want to underwrite 180-day loans or 360. So we've got some mechanisms we're talking about internally where we can provide longer term funding and we talk a bit in some of our kind of public information about this risk-adjusted dynamic pricing concept, where we're lending in a 12 or 24-month vault, and what's happening is that the pricing of that loan gets adjusted based upon what happens with the volatility of the floor. And it doesn't mean we're lending just against floor assets, but we're benchmarking the loan against the floor value, and then we're adjusting it on that. So that's an imperfect. So that's a big thing on the slab for us in terms of what we want to do. And I suppose there's a couple of other areas that we're focused on. We are obviously pooling liquidity, and we have some different concepts about what those should look like. We have competitive pricing coming in. We have queuing systems that we're kicking around. So we'd like to roll those out over the next 6-12 months so that from both ends, right, that we've got better quality product offering for borrower, longer term capital, right, for the right borrower, and also we're getting dynamic pricing coming in. And also people can choose where they sit in the capital stack, right? If people on a particular asset, so we're asset specific, we're not creating a pool that's lending against a collection. So if people are coming in, they can choose where they want to sit in that waterfall. They want to be less, they're less risk averse, they've got a lower interest rate. They're more risk averse, they've got a higher interest rate. So those are the things that we're planning to roll out. And those are the key two offerings, over and above just education, awareness in this space.
So, one of the things, we talked to a lot of people kind of in this space, and we're probably one of the bigger liquidity providers, and it's a business at the end of the day, right? One of the things we're hearing from a lot of players, especially in the alternative asset lending sort of space, is that this is a race to the bottom, right? In terms of rates, in terms of clientele, in terms of longevity. So it's a business, but it could end up being a business where you're competing with millions of liquidity providers, especially if you're going P2P or P2Pool institutions, which we think is necessary to grow the space. And then interest rates that, started, a few months ago, if you were lending at, 40, 50, 60, there was some 100% sort of loans. And now all of a sudden you're starting to see everything dip sub 20, sub 15. What happens in that scenario? Or how do you, think about that sort of side of the business?
Yeah, well, look, do I view it as a race to the bottom? Yeah, it potentially is. We share the same view, or I share the same view, that pricing will come down as the marketplace matures. And that's a factor of a couple of areas. It's more institutional liquidity coming in, for sure. And we talked about that on stage. You see that in the peer-to-peer traditional lending, right? They started off as borrower individual versus lender individual. And they've moved away from that liquidity being provided by individuals because it's totally inefficient. So they're getting institutional liquidity in against individual borrowers in traditional P2P, right? So that must be the trajectory that we're on. But we don't see that necessarily as a bad thing, because there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, we see other types of assets being brought online. And what we do think is initially that a lot of that institutional funding, because incumbent institutions are relatively slow moving, they're risk averse, they've got people sat on credit committees, right? I've sat there before, and they will gravitate towards what they perceive to be the less risky assets. So some of that liquidity that's coming in will be soaked up by these other assets that are coming to the space that are being tokenized. So that will, I think that will give us that are operating in this space some breathing space, right? Because they won't automatically fall through to NFT lendings and lending against JPEGs and monkeys and alike. So I do think we've got an opportunity here to continue to lend at relatively attractive adjusted risk reward, and I do see that going forward. But going back to the first point in this discussion, liquidity is good because it drives down pricing for borrowers, and then it attracts a different type of price borrower as well, right? So you'll have more, as liquidity drives down, you'll have a bigger pool of people that are interested in borrowing. We've got a finite number of Bored Apes. That's not going to grow. There'll be other collections that will come online. What we need to do as an industry is convert some of them owners into taking finance, and a large part of that is pricing coming down. So we think the pool's going to be big enough And we just want to be, we're doing our thing differently. If we're able to be a small bit of that pie that grows, then we'll view it as a success.
Yeah, so just a tangent there. You're talking about knowing your borrower almost, right? KYB instead of KYC, right?
Yeah.
I like that. Early on, we saw people, when we started lending 6 months ago, feels like forever, right?
Yeah, sure.
That people were borrowing against NFTs to get into DeFi.
Yeah.
Like I have this ape, I can't do anything with it. I'm going to borrow some ETH and like go stake it on Magic Arbitrum, whatever, right? Earn 800% in a day, and hopefully I don't get liquidated.
Yeah.
Which was okay. That's a use case. Like, what what it would be in your mind a good use case, or a reason to, in your platform, say this would make a good borrowing case.
Yeah. So there's so there's two types of borrower out there. Well, there's lots of types of borrower, right? But so our vision for this space is that people don't have to have these short in and out loan positions. So what that means is that they don't have to take liquidity and know that in 14, 30, 60 days they've got to repay it. Because what it means is that, we've seen this from experience, right, from our bridging lending business, is they start to take risk with that capital, and that's not positive for anybody in that trade. Okay, so what you're able to do, if you're able to put longer term credit lines in place where they don't have fear of being liquidated, so that's the conundrum that we're working on and you're working on, that people need to fix, right? It's taking out that liquidation scenario, but having long-term lending lines in place. What that enables the borrower to do is they should be less risk averse. They'll put it into longer, maybe more less risky assets where they don't feel they need to be making a return in 1 day or 14 days. So longer term view. And I think what that dynamic does, if we're able to change that, is it delivers the type of borrower to us collectively as an environment that we're all striving for. Because none of us want to be lending against the person that takes all of their chips off the table from us and then puts them on red or black. And then when it comes to repayment day, they don't have any chips left. And those are not positive for anybody. So converting those short-term loans into longer-term loans historically has meant more stable relationships with that money from the borrowers. And that's been the case for years and years, right? That's not new to NFT lending. Where you put out longer-term money, people act more responsibly with that money. You put out shorter-term money, they act less responsibly with it.